Ladies and gentlemen, it is with enormous pleasure that I'm about to announce David Friedman as our next speaker. I first met David in August 1983 when he came to a book signing and a speech at the Alternative Bookshop. And this is quite an old book. Perhaps David no longer remembers what he said in it, because he's written so many other books since. But something that I most distinctly remember from reading this book, something that took about 20 years for me to accept fully, is David said, anarcho-capitalism is not the utopian option. Limited government is the utopian option because we've tried it many times, in many places, and in all places and at all times it's been tried and failed. And anarcho-capitalism has never been tried, but there is some chance that unlike limited government, it might work. And when I read this, I was a fairly conventional, limited government, sort of young conservative with vaguely heretical leanings, but I suppose this book, The Machinery of Freedom, helped make me the rather odd person that I've become. But of course, David has written so many other things. One of David's interests, and I do follow him with great interest myself in this, is in how various legal systems work, how other societies have managed to deal with crime and disorder, and generally speaking, how their legal procedures work. And many years ago, he wrote what I thought was a fascinating article about criminal legal procedure in 18th century England. David won't be talking about that today. He'll be talking about something completely different. But then David does so many things. He's an economist, an historian, a philosopher, and historical actor. That's right. So David is one of our Renaissance men. And so I give you David Friedman.
Actually, I prefer the Middle Ages. The book, this is my most recent book, and it grew out of a seminar that I taught at Santa Clara University Law School for some years. I generally invent seminars in order to educate myself. I believe that professors should exploit students as well as students exploiting professors, and when students write good papers, I get ideas to steal, and hopefully they steal ideas from me. And this particular seminar was called Legal Issues of the 21st Century, and I started teaching it late in the 20th century. And the way it worked was that each Thursday, I would discuss with the students some technology which I was willing to argue for at least a week was going to revolutionize the world. That on the weekend, the students would email me legal issues that revolution, if it happened, would raise. I would put them up on the web page for the other students to look at. Tuesday, we would discuss the legal issues. Next Thursday would be another revolution. So it was sort of modeled on these tours of Europe you hear about, where it's another capital every day. Or as I used to describe the seminar, nanotechnology has just turned the world to gray goo. It must be March. And the technologies that we covered and that I cover in the book, I should say the book is not limited to legal issues. It became much broader as it turned from a course into a book. They range from encryption and surveillance, which are two opposite technologies, as it were, one of which might give us more privacy than we've ever known, and one of which might give us less privacy than we've ever known. Anonymous e-cash, technological protection, intellectual property, a bunch of things that might make possible a world where a large part of commerce was occurring online. Biotechnology, nanotechnology, virtual reality. And I have a final chapter on space, which is really cheating because the book's basic rule was that I was only willing to go 30 years into the future, and the interesting stuff in space is going to take longer than that. But I have a sentimental fondness for space since Like many of you, I suspect, I grew up reading science fiction, and we were supposed to be in space by now in some serious fashion. And in the book and in the course, there is a sense in which I'm talking about two things. I'm talking about what the technologies are that might revolutionize things, but also about how such revolutions affect us and how one deals with them, how to adjust to them. This is going to be a very short version, but for those of you who are too cheap to buy the book, the full text is on my webpage. I retained online rights with the contract for publishing this book. And new technologies affect us in at least two different ways. One of them is they change what we can do and what other people can do. So that, for example, I used a word processor to write my second book. And after I finished that book, I came to the conclusion that prior to the invention of the word processor, no books were written, because it would just be too much work. And that's a case where the technology helps me. But of course, the technology also might make it easier for other people to do things I don't want them to do. So that some years ago, there was legislation referred to as the Digital Wiretap Bill that went through the US Congress, in which the FBI was saying that the shift of telephones to digital technology made wiretapping very hard, and they therefore wanted the phone companies to be required to provide them facilities for tapping phone lines when they had a legal court order to do that. Which is not an absurd kind of idea, just sort of maintaining the status quo. Somebody pointed out that the capacity they were asking for amounted, roughly speaking, to the ability to simultaneously tap 1 million phones, which some might have thought excessive. And if you think about it, it turns out that historically the real limit to wiretapping is not the difficulty of getting courts to approve it. The real limitation to wiretapping is that it was very expensive. Why was it very expensive? Because you have to hire somebody, probably a police officer, to spend hundreds of hours listening to conversations for every one sentence you pick up that's actually somebody doing something suspicious that you care about. This problem has been solved. We now have computer programs that turn speech into text. We have computer programs that can look through text for what look like signs of conversations about drug dealing or terrorism or bad political opinions or whatever you want to suppress. And that means that one can do wiretapping on a massive scale, having the computers do all the listening, and humans only get involved when the computer flags this conversation is probably interesting.
Is it legal?
I think it is certainly legal if you have a court order to wiretap. The interesting legal question is whether it's legal without a court order. I actually have in the book a passage that I refer to as my brief for the bad guys.
So there is no freedom.
Questions off.
My brief for the bad guys, what I mean by the bad guys are the FBI. And I suggest that you could make a plausible legal case that until a human listens to the conversation, it's not a wiretap, it's not violating privacy just because a computer has looked at it, it's not a person. And that therefore you could imagine the FBI saying, first we will have the computers listen to all of this. And then when they find something, we'll go to a judge and we say, look, the computer program says there's suspicious material on this tape, now give me a court order to listen to the tape. Which it seemed to me was not an absurd legal position, though not one I was terribly happy with. But I did some rough estimates, and my conclusion was that, well, let me go back a step. Have any of you ever seen a movie called The President's Analyst? It was an old comedy. I've seen very few movies, but I liked that one. And there's this great, the protagonist is the president's psychoanalyst, and all sorts of people are trying to get control of him in order to influence the president. And you eventually discover that the conspiracy behind all the other conspiracies is the phone company. You also discover that the phone company is now 100% automated. There are no longer any human beings at all. And there's this great scene where the protagonist goes into a phone booth on a rural road in order to call a CIA agent who's sort of a friend of his, who's a helper of his. And he makes the phone call, and he hangs up, and he tries to open the door of the phone booth, and it won't open. And down the road comes a phone company truck with some phone booths on the back and a crane. And it picks up his phone booth, puts it on the truck, picks up an empty phone booth, puts it on the place, and drives off. 30 seconds later, down comes a helicopter with the CIA agent, and a KGB agent who was a temporary ally of his. This happens in movies like this. And the CIA agent looks in astonishment at this empty phone booth. He says, "It can't be. Every phone in America tapped? Yeah, you think you are Russia?" It can't be. I'm not sure it's going to be, but my rough estimate is that for a few $1 billion worth of dedicated hardware, you could tap every phone in the U.S., just in terms of the data processing requirements. So that's an example where the technology makes it easier to do something, but it's something that many of us would like not to have done. Given that things change, how do you respond? And the first answer, and I think often the wrong answer, is you say, it's true, this technological change makes it harder to prevent privacy, so we just have to insist on judges not giving court orders to allow wiretapping. You say we will use whatever methods we're doing to accomplish our objective and just do it harder if necessary. All right, I'll come to a more striking example later when we think about copyright law. It's the wrong answer. The right answer is to say, why am I doing this? Does the new technology give me better ways of achieving what I want to achieve? So that the real solution, if the FBI is tapping every phone, is that all of those conversations should be encrypted. That the real solution is to say, what does the tech not fight the impossible fight against the things that the technology makes easier for them, but try to find the things the technology makes easier for us that achieve the same objective. That most of what we do, laws, customs, business methods, aren't objectives of their own. They're ways of achieving something. So what you want to ask yourself is, given the new circumstances, how do we best achieve what we were achieving? So let me go on to what I guess is one of the more immediate cases of this, which is what I like to refer to as the death of copyright. That copyright, the argument for copyright is that it gives people an incentive to write books, produce movies, make songs, all the rest of that stuff. And it does so by saying that if I produce intellectual property, you may not copy it without my permission, and therefore I can charge you a fee for copying. In order for that to be enforceable, however, you must be able to identify copiers and sue them. And with digital information, that's becoming harder and harder to do. Because if the intellectual property is in digital form, any user can copy it, and you can't very well be watching all of them. Now, it's true that if all I can do is to copy a friend's songs, I'm limited to the songs my friends have. So you can try to enforce copyright law by saying, we'll ignore the individual copier, but if anybody's copying things on a large scale and selling them, we'll go after him. But then the internet comes along, and you have decentralized mechanisms by which I can have 10 million friends, by which I can find somebody who has a song I want to copy and copy it, and now how do you sell songs? And same problem obviously exists for lots of other forms of intellectual property. If your view is, well, copyright law is the law, we just do whatever we have to do to enforce it, well, that's straightforward enough. We can change the laws so that every hard disk in the country must be accessible 24 hours a day to copyright owners who want to search it over the internet. And if you find someone else's intellectual property on your hard drive that you're not entitled to, we'll lock you up. Not a very satisfactory solution, but it's the sort of thing you have to do to enforce it. The alternative is to find other ways of achieving the same objective. And one way, which has been popular, although has very severe limits, is technological protection. The old idea was you sell your song inside an encryption box, as it were, inside software. And if I want to listen to the song, I've got to pay online or in digital cash or something, 10 cents each time I listen to it. And it ought to occur to you that that can't work. And the reason it can't work is that I pay 10 cents once, and I turn on my tape recorder. And I play the song, and I now have a copy outside of the encryption. This is what's referred to in the literature as the analog hole. The fact that however good your protection is, if the intellectual property is fully revealed in one use, then I only have to pay for one use in order to get it, and I can then pass it on to other people. It turns out, interestingly enough, however, that there are some forms of intellectual property which this doesn't apply to. For example, essentially every lawyer in the US pays money to Lexis or Westlaw, which are firms that have huge databases of legal information. if I do a search for cases in some particular issue, and I download the information from Lexis and pay for it, I could make copies of that result of that search for my friends, but none of my friends are asking the same questions, so it doesn't do any good. So all Lexis and Westlaw have to do is to protect their database, and they are home free without any intellectual property law. And some years ago, I was thinking about how could you do the equivalent for movies? How could you have an equivalent of a movie which was not fully revealed on one use so that people would pay to access, as it were, the source of the movie? And I was trying to imagine maybe a movie where you had multiple cameras and you could decide where you were looking for and things like that. And finally, it got through my thick head that I and members of my family were and had been for some time spending many hours a week as consumers of a substitute for movies which had precisely this characteristic. It's called World of Warcraft. If you think about the logic of online computer games, they are precisely an entertainment medium which is not revealed on a single use. That you can play World of Warcraft, and the software they provide you will let you film what you're doing. So you can record your whole adventure over an hour and a half in World of Warcraft. But none of your friends want to watch it. They want to have their own adventure. All right? So that's an interesting case where what is likely to happen is that as it becomes harder and harder to protect intellectual property, more and more efforts will go into things like World of Warcraft, fewer and fewer efforts into things like movies. Interesting prediction. So that's one answer. You can use technological protection provided it's a form of intellectual property that can be protected. Another solution is you give away your intellectual property and make your money indirectly. The obvious example is you're a band, you give away MP3s of your music and you charge for concerts. There's somewhere a comment by Bill Buckley in one of his books that the secret that authors don't tell you is that lecturing pays much better than writing books. And if you look at the history, quite a lot of prominent figures such as Mark Twain, I think also Anthony Trollope, if I remember, made a fair part of their income by getting famous by writing books and then being paid to go around the country giving public lectures. Other possible methods. You give away software that will only run on your computer and you sell the computer. That's a fairly common way of providing intellectual property when you can't protect it. Another possibility, for those of you with an antiquarian point of view, is the old patronage system. You read some 18th century book, and for some bizarre reason, the first page and a half consists of a eulogy of some nobleman you've never heard of, about what a wonderful, intelligent person he is, how he's a guiding light for the ages, and you suspect that he's been feeding the author of the book for the last 3 years. Well, the modern version of this would be, this song is brought to you courtesy of Apple Computer, which paid the concert to be the Apple concert for last year. And you could certainly imagine versions of that. So the general point I'm really making is that rather than saying, what desperate things can we do to keep enforcing copyright law, you ought to say, well, copyright law is in the process of becoming unenforceable. In a world where copyright law is unenforceable, how do we pay for producing intellectual property? And that's the right approach in all of these things. Let me take another case, and one which is harder and perhaps more interesting. And that's the case of defamation. Let us suppose that somebody asserts a whole bunch of false things about me, which I think are injurious. And there are two solutions to this problem, one of which isn't going to work anymore. And that one is the legal solution. So that you make false assertions about me, I sue you for slander or libel. In order for that to work, it has to be the case that when somebody makes false assertions that can reach a large audience, that A, I know who did it, and B, somebody who's responsible has enough money to be able to sue. Well, at the moment, with no significant resources, you can set up a web page. Once you have a web page, you can say anything about me that you like on the web page. And if you have no resources, suing you is sort of a waste of time. And if you're reasonably clever, you can set up a web page without telling anybody who you are. And it's real hard to sue people if you don't know who they are. So what that means is that the legal approach for preventing defamation is getting worse and worse. What's the other approach? The other approach to people telling lies about me is to answer them. That's getting easier and easier, because that same technology that makes it easier to spread lies about me also makes it easier for me to spread the truth about me. I don't know how many of you have used Usenet News. Usenet is a part of the internet that's older than the web. And it looks to the users like a whole lot of bulletin boards, where people have conversations, like 100,000 of them, that kind of scale of different groups. Conversations on various topics. And one of the interesting things about Usenet is that Google provides a search engine for it. This is not the same as a search engine for the web, it's the same company. What does this mean? It means that I can go up on my computer and in about 30 seconds discover whether anybody on 100,000 news groups mentioned my name in the last 24 hours. All I do is to type my name and maybe a couple of words to distinguish me from other people with the same name into the search engine, and it pops up, yes, so-and-so on this news group I've never heard of said such and such about you. All right. Well, the next thing I do is I click reply. And now the same series, the same conversation, the same series of statements in which somebody said something has next after what he said my answer to it. Just an amazing technology. I like to imagine that I am standing on a hill and the winds of the world blow to my ears any mention of my name. And I can then whisper my answer and the winds will blow it back to the same people who heard it. So it's a very impressive technology for the purpose of answering things. I should say, because it's relevant to the introduction, oddly enough, that on one occasion I found somebody quoting something like a page and a half from me, except that I hadn't written it. I think Murray Rothbard, isn't it? And the reason that's relevant is that, as I think I say in the book, though I'm not sure, the argument that limited government is a utopian idea is not mine. I believe I quote that from Murray. I disagree with Rothbard on lots of things, by the way. I'm not endorsing him, but it was a good point, and I am happy to steal good ideas from him. In any case, that's a solution for defamation on Usenet. It doesn't work on the web, though, because when you post your slanders about me on the web, there isn't any way that I can post them in a way such that everybody who reads your webpage will read my response. I can post them, and I can have my name on them, and with luck people will read your webpage and say, I wonder if it's true, and do a search, but there's no guarantee. However, there's a technological solution. And the solution is to have a browser which not only shows the links that you put into your webpage to other things, but also when somebody reads your webpage, shows the existence of links other people have to your page. Because then somebody in that kind of browser would see, aha, someone has commented on this webpage. Let's go see what he said. There's a legal problem. And the legal problem is that one can argue that under current copyright law, when the browser creates a version of your page with the backlinks, it's producing a derivative work. It's producing a form of intellectual property that incorporates your webpage but adds something to it. And it's doing it without your permission. And it is an open legal question whether doing that is a violation of copyright. It's an issue which comes up in an entirely different area of internet law, which I won't discuss, so-called framing controversy. But the reason it's interesting is that it suggests that if you want to prevent defamation online, part of what you have to do is to make sure that copyright law is not interpreted in a way that suppresses the way of using the internet to answer defamation. So that, again, rather than thinking about sort of direct connections of how do I make it possible to sue people, you say, how do I keep from blocking the ways in which the new technology can be used to accomplish the event. Let me discuss a different way. I said that one of the things that technological change does is to change what people can do. There's also a subtler way in which it affects us. We all look at the world through a system of simplifications. That nobody is bothered by the man on the television saying the temperature is 17 degrees in the shade. Even though we probably know that he hasn't specified which patch of shade he means, and that if it's 17 degrees in that patch of shade, it's probably 17.01 degrees in that patch of shade. So we're willing to think of the temperature in the shade as if it were well-defined, because it's well enough defined for practical purposes. And similarly, legal systems, almost everything we do, because the world is so complicated, involves a whole bunch of simplifications. Sometimes technological change makes our simplifications obsolete. And to take one very simple example, we're used to assuming that the concept of mother is well defined. Father too, actually, although that's sometimes more ambiguous on factual grounds. But the idea is supposed to be well defined. But it isn't true anymore. And to see why it isn't true, I will tell you the story of the child who had 5 parents. This is a true story. Real law case in California a few years ago. There was a couple who wanted a child. Unfortunately, not only was the husband sterile, but the wife was doubly infertile. She could neither produce a live egg nor bring a fetus to term. That's all right. That's why we have markets. They hired a sperm donor, an egg donor, and a host mother. And they produced a baby. Fine, no problem. Except that about the point when the baby was born was the point at which the couple broke up. And now the question for the courts was, who has parental rights and duties with regard to that baby? And for those who believe you just read the law as it's written, the answer is pretty straightforward. Under California law, the legal mother is the host mother, because California law says that the mother is the woman from whose body a baby is born. And under California law, thanks to England, thanks to Lord Mansfield, in fact, the legal parent is the husband of the host mother, because Lord Mansfield's rule, established in the 18th century, says that if a woman bears a child conceived when she was cohabiting with her husband, the husband cannot challenge the paternity of that child. Fortunately, the California courts chose to ignore the plain reading of the law and instead to interpret parenthood as defined by intention and to hold that the original couple was the legal parents. But it's a nice case because we take it for granted that we know what mother means. We don't know what mother means. With current technology, there is an egg mother. There could even be 2 egg mothers because mitochondrial DNA is distinct from the ordinary DNA, cellular DNA, and there are reasons why in some cases you might be able to produce a baby using the mitochondrial DNA of one person and the non-mitochondrial DNA of another. So that gets us up to 2 mothers, mitochondrial DNA and non-mitochondrial DNA. Then we've got the host mother as a third category. And of course it's going to go further than this because as we get better and better at biotech, we will eventually be able to do cut and paste genetic engineering. And you will then have the person who was created with a sperm that was a cut and paste job from 6 different donors, an egg that was a cut and paste job from 5 different donors, born in the body of a 12th person, perhaps produced to be raised by a 13th and 14th person. So that's a nice case where one result of the technological change is to make categories. Let me give you a different one, and this is one of the ones that I got from one of my students, who did a very interesting paper. And that is that we're also used to assuming in our simplified world that everybody is either male or female. And in this case, it's not really technology, it's increased knowledge. We now know that while most people are either XX genetically with a female body or XY genetically with a male body, there are some people who are XX with what appears to be a male body. There are some people who are XY with what appears to be a female body. And there are a fair number of people who are neither XX nor XY, but any of several more complicated genetic structures, which may show up as appearing to be male or female. And if that weren't enough, we also know that there are some people who are genetically and physically male who tell you, clearly believing it, that in their head they're female. And there are some people who are physically and genetically female who will tell you, as far as I can tell truthfully, that in their head they are and have always been male. And we now have, of course, sex reassignment surgeries that let you alter the body to at least an approximation of what you say your brain is. So that means that if you really think about it carefully enough, male and female are no longer an accurate set of simplifications, and that raises a bunch of problems. student paper that got me thinking about this was looking at how different institutions, how sports handled this question, how prisons handled this question, and so on. But it was a nice sort of general point of the ways in which categories change. Let me give you a different one, and this one is due directly to technology. We are used to assuming that everybody in the world is either alive or dead. There are, at this point, well over 100 people of whom this assumption is quite dubious. You are dying of an incurable disease, and you are a technological optimist. And so what you do is you arrange that a second after you are declared legally dead, you are frozen. Your body is reduced to the temperature of liquid nitrogen with various precautions to minimize but not eliminate the damage done by the process of freezing you. And you are going to be stored until two things happen. The easy one is that somebody finds a cure for what was killing you. The hard one is that someone finds a cure for being frozen. While it's true that one is not at all certain that these things will happen, it's still a pretty good gamble if you compare it to the alternative. So the question is, what is the legal status of people who have been frozen? As I say, I think it's somewhat over 100 at the moment. Let us suppose that I am such a person. I'm declared legally dead. My wife is a widow. She remarries. I'm declared legally dead, so I no longer own any property, so my heirs inherit. Technological progress turns out to be much faster than we expected. And 10 years later, there is a news story that they have successfully thawed a dog and he barked. And it's obvious that pretty soon they'll be thawing people as well. And a week later, my ex-wife's, my widow's husband, and my heirs break into the storage facility where my body is stored, smash the vessel containing my body in liquid nitrogen, and when they are questioned as to the reasons for this act of clear vandalism, they explain that they could not tolerate having somebody dear to them preserved in such a mockery of what crime have they committed? Clearly they've done something wrong. I mean, that storage facility belonged to Alcor. They had to break down a door. They had to smash this thing. They owe some damages, and maybe they should go to jail for a month or so. What is the one crime they cannot have committed? Murder. I'm dead. I was declared legally dead. If I hadn't been declared legally dead, they couldn't have frozen me, because they would have been murderers. So that suggests that if the number of people so frozen increases, if people come to think there's a significant probability this is going to work, we are going to have to create a legal category somewhere between alive and dead. And conceptual categories. If you are a good religious person who doesn't believe in bigamy, are you willing to marry the wife of somebody who is frozen? Is she still, should she be willing to marry you? Should she think of herself as a widow or merely temporarily separated from her husband? Let me give you another example where these categories matter. Let us suppose, and this happens to be a real case, that you are dying of a degenerative disease, and by the time, brain cancer in this case, and by the time you are legally dead, there's not going to be enough left of your brain to reconstruct whatever they do. So you conclude that you would be happy to trade your last 6 months of misery for a shot at the future, and you would like Alcor to freeze you right now. They can't. The person in question went to a California court, and the California court ruled that he could not be legally frozen until he was legally dead. Now, fortunately, then there was a reversion of the cancer, so as far I think he's still alive as far as I know, but it does raise the point that how the law handles this stuff, whether they think of freezing somebody as killing him or merely as a dangerous medical operation that might or may not succeed, is going to matter. Let me go on to some issues which started some of my interest in this technological stuff. And I want to start out with encryption. How many people in this room know what public key encryption is? For the ones who don't, I want to send a message to you, and I want to make sure that he doesn't intercept it and read it. And so the obvious solution is that I scramble the message in some way such that if he does intercept it, he can't read it. The traditional way of doing this is that I have a key, which is typically just a long number, which contains the information describing how it was scrambled. And so I send him both the message and the key separately, and he can then use the key to unscramble that message and all future messages. And of course, there's a problem with this. And the problem is that the reason I needed encryption in the first place was I was afraid somebody was reading my messages to him. Well, what if they read the one that had the key in it? All right. This problem has been solved. And the solution is an ingenious process in which you create a pair of keys, two long numbers, with a mathematical relation between them, such that if you scramble a message with one of them, you need the other one to unscramble. So I create a pair of keys. I label one of them my private key and one of them my public key. And my public key I tell to anybody who wants to know it. I put it in the phone book. I put it up on a sign on a billboard on the highway. My private key never leaves my possession. If you want to send me a message, you encrypt it with my public key, you send it to me, and I use my private key to decrypt it. If he intercepts the message, and if he has my public key, that's just fine. If he has my public key, he can send me messages too. But he can't read my messages, because that's on the private. There's a second non-obvious effect of this technology. Suppose I want to send him a message and prove it's from me. I encrypt it with my private key. I attach a note saying who it's from. He decrypts it with my public key, because either one will decrypt with the other one encrypted. The fact that what he gets is not gibberish means it was encrypted with the private key that matches that public key. Only I have the private key that matches that public key, so it must be for me. And that's how digital signatures work. It's more complicated, but that's the basic logic of how a digital signature works. If you think about it, this set of technologies is potentially of enormous power, because it means that people can interact online in a way in which nobody but the intended recipient can read any message, and a way in which I can prove my online identity without having to reveal my real space identity. So that it is a technology that makes it possible to combine anonymity and reputation. So among other things, one result, which is sometimes good and sometimes bad, is that it makes it possible to have criminal firms with brand name reputation. Suppose you wanted to have somebody killed. I gather from the news reports that the cost for a hitman is less than the cost for a new car. And most of us can buy a new car if it's important enough to us. So what really prevents you, other than any moral qualms you might have about murdering people, and there may be some people you don't have moral qualms about murdering, what really prevents it is the fact that you do not know how to find a reliable seller of that service. And the attempt to look for a reliable seller of that service is itself rather risky. That problem we can solve. Let me describe to you my business plan for Murder Incorporated. It starts with some billboards with a long number on it and the message, write down this number. The next step is an ad appearing in several prominent publications, which appears to be gibberish. The next step is a very high-profile assassination. My guess is that politicians aren't important enough, so it's probably a bomb at the Academy Awards. Or maybe taking out a World Series team or something like that. Somebody important, somebody people care about. The next step is a message to everybody who's interested saying that that billboard number some of you wrote down is a key. And if you use that key to decrypt that gibberish ad, you will discover a description of the assassination published 2 days before it happened. We have now demonstrated that that is the key that belongs to an organization that is both willing and able to murder people. Well, now we've got that. Now that organization goes into business. If you want to send them an inquiry about purchasing their services, you encrypt it with their public key and nobody but them can read it. When you receive instructions on how to deliver the money to pay for the assassination, those instructions are signed using their private key, so you know they're really from them and not from the FBI trying to entrap you. So this technology essentially gives us a level of privacy high enough not only to scare the NSA and the FBI, but occasionally to scare me. But it also has some very attractive features, because it means that freedom of speech no longer depends on the views of the courts. It only depends on the laws of mathematics. You can't jail somebody if you don't know who he is. And yet you could be a highly prominent political agitator online while concealing your actual real space identity. It also has certain effects for tax collection, which is one reason the government might not approve of this idea. Because if I earn money in cyberspace and spend it in real space, the government can tax me via consumption tax. If I earn money in real space and spend it in cyberspace, the government can tax me via income tax. But if I earn money in cyberspace and spend it in cyberspace, all of that encrypted, none of it is ever visible, hence none of it can be taxed. So that is a further conclusion, and some people would say that's a terrible thing, the government can't get the money it needs. Others feel that on the whole the government gets a little bit more money than it needs, and so reducing its ability might be a good thing rather than Let me make my point a little more generally. And that is, if you think about just the online world, because I'm imagining a future where more and more human activities are moving online. The online world in certain odd ways is the libertarian paradise. Because libertarians worry about having rights violated by force and fraud. And as long as everything is happening online, you're limited to fraud. You can't get a bullet through an Ethernet cable. All right? So if you have a world where people interact online and where their real space identities are concealed so you can't get at them in real space, now you can still trick them. But that's all you can do. And that's a much safer world for us. And I, in fact, have some published work on how in that world you enforce contracts by essentially using reputational mechanisms with various of the encryption used to prove facts, in effect, to prove who signed what contract. With private arbitration, I'm not going to go into that here. The basic point is that one can imagine, as it were, leveraging up the technology that comes out of public key encryption to a whole world, which in effect is anarcho-capitalism online, ordinary government in real space, and in a future where more and more moves online, that might not be such a bad thing. Now let me tell you the other side. I've been talking about the way in which technology makes us more private. But England is, of course, the striking example of the new technology that's going to make us less private, that being surveillance. And on the face of it, what's happened in England is happening to some extent elsewhere. It doesn't seem that scary, that you have a video camera up on a pole aimed at some public place so that if there's a crime, we'll have a record of it. And you would say, well, look, all you're doing is the same thing as having a policeman standing there watching for a record. The only difference is that the policeman is now indoors watching a screen. He's out of the rain. He's got a comfortable seat. Isn't that an improvement? So far, it's all right. Now let's add two more technologies, one of which we've had for a while and one of which we're getting. And the one we're getting is face recognition software. So let us suppose that our face recognition software is good enough so that a computer can look over all of those many miles of video film, only they're obviously in computer memory instead, and identify who the people are on the film. And we have database software to organize that information. So I like to imagine the trial 15 years in the future, where the prosecutor says to the defendant, where were you at 3 p.m. on January 7th of last year? Oh, I'm sorry, I don't need to ask that question. I'm on date. There's the film. That's the film showing where you were at 3 p.m. on Friday of last year. So that you can imagine a system where using extensive surveillance plus face recognition plus database, everything anybody has done in a public place is now known and findable. And of course, as the technology improves, video cameras get smaller. Eventually, we have video cameras with the size and the aerodynamic characteristics of a mosquito. And we now don't have to limit ourselves to public places. So you can imagine in the extreme, everything that happens in real space is recorded and findable. That's what David Brin, in a book of his, referred to as the Transparent Society. And Brin basically concluded there's no way of stopping it, the best you can do is to make it uniformly transparent so that not only the police can watch us, but we can watch them. And I find that unsatisfactory because they can arrest us and we can't arrest them. So then the next step is, let's suppose that both of these technologies happen. Suppose we get both what I call strong privacy, which is what my encryption gives me, and David Brin's transparent society. What does that world look like? And that hinges on two different questions. The first one is, can I control my interface with cyberspace? That after all, it does no good for me to be typing messages into my computer which are going to be encrypted with very, very strong encryption if there's a video mosquito up here watching me type. So therefore, in order for the privacy side of it to work, we have to have ways in which I can communicate with cyberspace that can't be easily observed in real space. And you can imagine a number of possible ways of doing it. The low-tech version is I'm typing under a hood, but you can think of fancier versions. The second question is how much of life is in cyberspace and how much is in real space. And that then gets us into another technology that I discussed and find very interesting, which is virtual reality. Because there's really no reason why I had to put up with flying from America here to give this talk. We're just a little bit behind the times. But we could, after all, imagine that all of you have little video goggles on, and each of you is sitting at home. There's no reason why you had to come to London either. But each of you is seeing exactly what you're now seeing. Well, not exactly. My hair is not as gray. If there are any stains on my shirt, the computer has carefully removed them. And of course, every one of you has the best seat in the house. Furthermore, well, actually, we can't even improve this. This one we did, you people somehow did it right. The room was almost exactly full. The basic rule for lectures, in case you don't know, is always get a room that's just a little bit too small. Some talks I should have given in a closet. But with virtual reality, we can always adjust the size of the room to fit the size of the audience. So as those technologies get better, you can imagine a future, and I discuss it in much more detail here, in which almost all human activity is occurring in cyberspace, in which when you visit somebody, you don't physically go there, you let your fingers do the walking. We've done that for a long time. We call it a telephone call, which is, in effect, a low bandwidth version of virtual reality. You know, it used to be when you saw somebody walking down the street talking to himself, you thought he was crazy. Nowadays, you know he's got a Bluetooth earphone and he's talking on a cell phone. So you could imagine as the virtual reality gets better, that people will do most of their socializing without moving, most of their business without moving, that in the limiting case, we're all living in little cubicles, we're being fed soybean mush, but that's all right because taste is just a sensation, and with really good full-sense virtual reality, all that soybean mush comes into us as sushi and Baskin-Robbins ice cream and good stuff like that. And in that world, we don't really care how many video mosquitoes there are. All right, all the interesting stuff is happening in cyberspace. So that's one limiting case. And the basic point I'm making is only that how much privacy we get is in part going to depend where we are between where we are now and here. There are other elements of this. There are known ways now for producing fully anonymous digital cash. That is, we know how to set up a system where I can make a payment to you by sending you a message. You don't have to know who I am. Just, I have to know how to get a message to you. I don't have to know who you are. And the bank that holds the money doesn't have to know the identity of either of us. So you can have the exact equivalent of paper cash done online. Nobody is doing it yet, probably because governments discourage banks from doing these things, but only one bank in one country has to do it, and the whole world can use it. One of the things that means is that money laundering laws become unenforceable, because I can transfer money by just sending a message, and in general, government's ability to know what we're doing goes down a whole lot. Let me go on from encryption and surveillance and stuff to a different, how tight am I? How long am I? All right, 5 minutes. Oh, sure. Let me talk a little about biotech. And let me start with designer babies. And I want to start with what I like to refer to as libertarian eugenics. And this is based on an idea in one of Robert Heinlein's earliest and worst novels. That is to say, the novel's got some really neat ideas, but as a novel, it's pretty bad. And his others, some of them are pretty good. And his idea is you have a form of eugenics which doesn't consist of controlling who gets to have babies. It just lets parents control which babies they have. Because after all, I and my wife could have any of, I suppose, billions, probably more than billions, of different possible children, depending on which subset of my genes and which subset of her genes happen to be randomly chosen for the combination. It doesn't have to be random. All right, as the technology gets better, we get to select one sperm of mine that doesn't carry the genes for my bad heart. We get to select one egg of hers that doesn't carry the genes for her poor circulation, but make sure that we keep the genes for her musical ability, for example. I should say I've been engaged at this point in a 3-generation project to breed musical ability back into my father's descendants. And when my grandson grows up, we'll see how it goes. The way you do that, of course, is 3 generations of marrying musical wives. I'm married 2 of them. So in any case, that would be one technology which might change the world quite a lot. Another one is the one that was discussed by a speaker this morning, namely life extension. We're all dying of a fatal disease called old age, and it's worth thinking about what the world would be like if we cured that. So I spent some time in the book, in part on the question, if you were going to live for many hundreds of years, what would you do? What would life be like? How would you change your life pattern? How would people keep working? Would they save up enough so they could retire? Things of that sort. Let me go on to another technology, and one of the very exciting ones, which is nanotechnology, where the basic idea is that the machines we build, things like this, are very, very crude. Their smallest working parts involve billions and trillions of atoms. We ourselves are machinery that's designed on the atomic scale. An enzyme is essentially a molecular machine, or a DNA screen. And the suggestion that was made some time ago is, as we get more technologically sophisticated, we ought to be able to build like that. We ought to be able to build molecular machines, machines where the parts are essentially single atoms. And it turns out that if you can do that, there's an awful lot of nice stuff you can do. For example, there's a design that's been worked out for an improved red blood cell. It's a very small compressed oxygen tank. And it's good enough so that just as a precaution, you inject yourself so that maybe 1% or 2% of your blood cells are replaced with these things. And then you have a heart attack. And you call up the doctor, and you make an appointment, and you drive in to see him because you've got several hours of oxygen in your bloodstream, so you don't need your heart until that oxygen wears out. The fancier one is the cell repair machine, which is a miniature robot submarine that goes through your body fixing everything that's wrong. So Aubrey de Grey doesn't have to do all this stuff. This is a once and for all solution to all of it. The more general interesting point about nanotechnology is that from the standpoint of a molecular machine, the world is a whole lot of Legos. It's a whole lot of atoms, all of them identical of each kind. So building stuff is really easy. You just grab atoms and stick them together. So the big breakthrough in nanotech occurs when you make a general purpose assembler. And a general purpose assembler is a molecular machine for building other molecular machines. And it's a general one, sort of a robot factory, and you have some way of giving it instructions, and it then starts pulling atoms out of whatever its environment is and assembling whatever you tell it to assemble. Now, the first assembler is really hard to make. The second assembler is trivial, because one of the molecular machines an assembler can build is a copy of itself. Right? We do that too, but our copies aren't very precise. And so that means that once you have one assembler, you have 2, once you have 2, you have 4, once you have 4, you have 8, and you very quickly have a quadrillion or so, however many you need. You then give them instructions and set them to work. My procedure for getting an automobile, for example, if only somebody would write the instructions for building it, is you dig a pit in the ground, you put in lots of dirt that's got aluminum and iron and stuff in it, you dump a little gasoline that can be taken apart for power, and you then set loose your billion assemblers, and in the morning there's an automobile. Sounds magical. How do you think they make oak trees? All right, same basic principle, just a little faster. So that gives you an economy that oddly enough looks a lot like the software economy. It gives you an economy where for physical objects, almost all the cost is the design. Because designing something an atom at a time is not a trivial process, all right? But once you have the design, now making a few thousand copies is pretty easy. So now we have the usual economic problems of how do you pay for things that may be easily reproduced. But that would be another long story. One more technology, and that's artificial intelligence. We don't know what we are, what human beings are. That's a very old puzzle. But we have a guess. And our guess is that what I am is software running on the hardware of my brain. That for what we know about computers and computer programming comes closer to explaining people than anything else does. If that's right, then as the physical hardware we build gets better and better, and as we come to understand how our brains work better and better, at some point we ought to be able to build people. We ought to be able to build programmed computers that have human-level intelligence. Raymond Kurzweil, who's a fairly prominent computer person, estimates 30 years. Well, it should be very interesting. We'll have a whole bunch of different kinds of human beings to deal with. How about 40 years? If we assume that progress on computers continues at the current rate, if in 30 years they are at human level, in 40 years we are gerbils. And we better hope they like peace. When I gave a talk on this subject at Google, I don't know, a month ago or something, early on I said, people worry about global warming as a problem in the future. And global warming might be a problem, and certainly there are arguments that it is, but it's a pretty wimpy catastrophe. 100 years, in 100 years, what will it do? Raise the sea level by a foot or two and raise temperatures by 2 degrees. I've got 3 different technologies that could wipe out our species in less than 100 years. Artificial intelligence is one of them. I won't, given the time constraints, I won't go into how you wipe out our species with nanotech and biotech. Those probably pretty obvious. So I think I'm running out of time. And there are lots more stuff I could talk about, but I'm not going to talk about it now. However, you can get all of it by either buying the book or going to my webpage and reading the book. My webpage is www.daviddfriedman.com. So as long as you remember the D, it's really easy to find. I'd like to talk for longer, but I'd like even more to have questions. And so being an economist, I will take my preferred option.
So much said. Questions, and again, because so many people will have questions, I want questions, not statements from the floor. Questions, and do state your name when you stand up, because I don't always know it, and the camera won't. So the gentleman over there with glasses. You.
Yeah, yes, I was asking about...
No, sorry, not you. The other.
Hello, yes, my name is Michael. I have a question regarding the perception of the relationship between the state and the private sphere. Do you believe that states, irrespective of how large they start off, will always tend towards some kind of totalizing security kind of system, or do you think that there is grounds for reconciliation in some kind of limits?
I think it's clear that not all states become total. What I'm skeptical about is that you can restrict the size of the state by things like constitutional rules. That I think there are clearly things that restrict a state. Most obviously, the point at which increasing tax rates bring in decreasing revenue. So that if you happen to have a technology where it's easy for taxpayers to hide their income, in such technology, states aren't going to get very big. All right? And you can think of a whole lot of other technological and other variables that will affect it, and probably ideological variables affect it as well. What I'm skeptical about, and what I was really picking up Rothbard's wisecrack on, is that you can build a limited government. You can say, all right, this is how big it ought to be, here are the rules, it won't go any bigger than that. Because there are clearly reasons why governments have a tendency to expand, and they are likely to eventually run into limits, but they're not limits that are written into the Constitution, they're limits in terms of what they actually have the power to do.
Tom Burrows next. Tom.
Yes, Tom Burrows. How concerned should we be about some of the more potentially nightmare scenarios that have been cast in, say, the
If you mean, are these things that are serious risks and you ought to think about how to deal with them if they happen? Yes. If you mean, should we be trying to stop them? Probably no. That one of the points I make early in the book is that listening to some of the downside possibilities, you may say, stop the train, I want to get off. This train does not have brakes. That is to say, now that's an exaggeration, but it's a slight exaggeration. Because think about, for example, AI. If my computer is noticeably smarter than your computer, I can make money on the stock market, in effect betting against you. I can probably make better tanks and airplanes than you can. I can use my computer to make better decisions on how to use those tanks and airplanes. There are a whole bunch of ways in which making better computers than you benefits me. So even if everybody says we don't really want to make them too good, in a world without a world government, and I regard a world government as the cure worse than the disease, in a world without a world government, somebody is going to take each next step because each next step produces benefits for them. And therefore, it is very hard to see how you would prevent those benefits. Life extension is another example. Various people, as Aubrey points out, are negative on life extension. It's hard to see why, but they are. Even if lots of people are negative, there are a whole lot of people in the world who are rich, powerful, and old. And that means that there's almost, if the technology makes possible life extension, there is almost certainly going to be somewhere where people are working on that problem. So my guess is that although things like what you vote to fund with government money will have some effect, maybe if you fund life extension enough with government money, you can kill it. But that a good first approximation, as it were, is that the logic of the technology is going to take it where it takes us, and that what you want to do instead is to say, given that this is going to happen, how should we deal with it? How should we react? So that, going back to my copyright example at the beginning, I don't think it makes sense to say, let's make it impossible for computers to copy things in order to preserve copyright. It makes sense to say it is going to be impossible to enforce copyright for many forms of intellectual property in the fairly near future. Given that, how do you deal with that?
Next question, the young man there.
Hi,
What's your name?
Me?
Yes.
Yes, my name is Hugo. I was intrigued by your ideas about an assassination business and
Yes.
how it would evade the law. I wonder if you're aware of Jim Bell's ideas on
Yes.
setting up a subscription website.
I am not ever proposing to actually do it. I was not suggesting it for political purposes.
Would it be possible at all, though? Because all activity on the internet requires servers in the real world. Surely the government will always.
Yeah, but the server can be anywhere in the world. And my guess is, though maybe I'm wrong, that for any illegal activity, you can always find some place in the world where you can set up your server and put the local police on salary. And if somebody from some other country decides to try to find out whose server it is and get you, they'll give you 24 hours warning. So my guess is that for anything very profitable, there are going to be ways around the attempts to control it. But I could be wrong. But I mean, maybe I'm an optimist or a pessimist, depending on how you look at that particular question.
Okay, the gentleman there with the open brown shirt. So, and your name as well.
Professor Friedman.
Your name?
Jay. Harry Brown once wrote a book which had a great title, I think, called How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World. My question is, looking back on your sort of long career in the freedom movement, do you think that you have found freedom in an unfree world?
Well, I hope I haven't found it in the form that Harry Brown describes, because I don't think that feeling free to walk out on your wife and abandon her, which is one of the things he gives as an example, counts as freedom. That is to say, I think I am and ought to be constrained by moral obligations, and he thought he shouldn't be, at least in that book. I would say that I've had a pretty free life, in that I don't think there is anything very important that I want to do that the government keeps me from doing. It takes some of my money, but I have enough money so that isn't a really serious problem. I can't think of anything. As it happens, I have no particular desire to use any of the illegal drugs. I suppose it would be nice if all those drugs were legal. We would have a whole lot more information about them, and I might then decide that something like LSD, if one knew enough about it and know how to do it safely, would be an interesting experience to have But basically, none of those restrictions affect me very much. Now, it's true that I will probably die younger due to there being less progress in medicine doing various government activities, but that sort of is in the future. I'm in pretty good shape at the moment. So I would really have to say that in terms of my own life, I think it has been pretty free. I mean, you know, as I say, it might be freer if they weren't taxing me, but that has not, in practice, been a very serious restriction.
Okay, let me see who else has a question. Benny Cousin.
The outcome of the California case with the, if you like, 5 parents, you said it was fortunate. Why?
Because it seems to me that having the people who made the decision that caused the child to come into existence be the ones responsible for that child makes a good deal more sense than having somebody who merely played a sort of subsidiary role in that process. Just as I think it is a sensible rule to say that if I shoot you, I and not the person who sold me the gun is responsible. And it seems to me that the host mother is equivalent to the person who sold you the gun. She provided a perfectly legitimate input. She had no way of knowing that that couple was going to break up. They ought to be responsible for it. So it seems to me that's the right way that the law ought to exist. If you look at the pre-existing law basically reflects the technology a few hundred years ago. Just take Lord Mansfield's rule for a moment. The rule which says that a husband in effect, cannot contest the paternity of his wife's children. That was a very sensible rule in a world in which, with rare exceptions, you never proved who was the father of the child. You know, they say it's a wise child knows his father. It's no longer true. All it takes is a decent lab. We have paternity testing. I like to refer to paternity testing as the stealth reproductive technology. Because everybody talks about things like cloning, which have had no effect in the world yet. But paternity testing, one of the central facts of all human societies is that a man does not automatically know who his children are. A woman does because they come out of her body. If you think about how human societies structure mating, almost always, with rare exception, it is a system in which a man has exclusive sexual access to a woman in order that he will know that her children are his. Doesn't work perfectly, obviously, but it works pretty well. We no longer have that constraint. I don't know what the effect will be. The interesting question is whether male sexual jealousy is hardwired or not. If men have evolved to very much want the women they are sleeping with not sleep with anybody else, then nothing's going to change. If what's happened is that men have evolved to want to know who their children are, then you can imagine a lot of other possible mating patterns that might work now that we have the technology to solve that problem. So that sort of is an interesting case. But anyway, Lord Mansfield's rule is now obsolete, and it does not make a whole lot of sense to try to maintain it.
Okay.
I think Lord Mansfield was also one of the people who mistreated John Wilkes, so that's another reason. What? He did it. Well, he found that slavery was illegal in England. That's true. So he did one good thing.
Philip Chanston.
Yes. In a world without scarcity, such as effectively normal goods, where real men have bags, can be designed without too much difficulty. Normal monetary systems fall by the wayside. You get people like Cory Doctorow who argue that monetary systems are based on status and other forms of value. My question to you is, what do you think will be the economic effects of some of the...
I think I've heard Doctorow actually describe the position there didn't seem to be coherent in terms of how his fictional system was going to work. But I would have said that even if nanotech gives you a much more plentiful society, there are still going to be things that are scarce. The nanotech land is still scarce, human services are scarce, people praising you are scarce, that's sort of getting towards an input to status. Status matters. I don't think you can monetize status. You can certainly say that one of the forms of exchange we engage in, I mean, we do it now. I will cite you in my journal article, and we'll understand that you'll cite me in your journal article. That's a status market that's happening. The more interesting thing along those lines to me is the pattern you get in things like the open source community, where you're having coordination by voluntary exchange, but it happens to take a non-monetary form. And that has worked successfully for a number of projects. And one of my chapters, actually, is starting out with the observation that if you look at the people at the beginning of most sciences, most of them were amateurs. Adam Smith is an exception, but David Ricardo was a retired stock market prodigy. Malthus was a clergyman. Darwin was a clergyman. So you have, a large part of the foundation of biology and economics being done by amateurs. The two people who are responsible largely for modern geology were a mining engineer and a gentleman farmer. If you look at from late 19th century on, everything is being done by professionals. And the question is that going to reverse? Are we going to have a world where the combination of high real incomes, which mean that if you want to, you can spend a bit of your life earning enough to have a tolerably comfortable life, and then devote your energy to your passion for status or other reasons, thus be an amateur scholar, plus communication technologies that means you don't have to be down the hall from somebody else working in your field, because everybody is down the hall from you. You just turn on your computer. Whether that combination might mean a reversion to a world where a lot of interesting stuff was being done by volunteer work rather than by professionals. And I just don't know. My sort of poster child for that is an economist named Robin Hanson, who you may or may not have heard of. He's at George Mason. When I first knew Robin, he was a scientist working for NASA, whose hobby was inventing institutions. And he invented a very interesting institution called the idea market, which was a way of getting markets to generate information. And he eventually got sufficiently interested so that he went back to college, got a PhD in economics, and is now a professor at George Mason. But I was corresponding with him before he did that, because it was clear that he was more interesting to correspond with than most other economists, because he was a smart, creative person. And I'm wondering how much of that is likely to happen. One of my hobbies is medieval cooking. And there are professionals, but there's an awful lot of good work that's been done by amateurs of one sort.
We've reached exactly 5:30, and I feel that I ought to stop. Yes, I will stop. No, I'm reluctant to stop. I'd like to carry on till 6:30 until David falls down from lack of food and drink, but it would be unfair to do so. So I would like to thank David Friedman for an excellent discussion, an excellent talk. I'd like to thank you as well for having given him such short and pointed questions. A very civilized session. So let's have a round of applause for David Friedman. A couple of announcements to make. The first is that in the Lady Violet room, just down the hall, you have a number of books and other publications. Some very good books by a young person called Sean Gabb. A great big heavy novel of ideas by Nicholas Dykes. You have a vast mass of literature from Civitas, from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and from various others. Oh, the Liberty Fund as well, don't forget the Liberty Fund. And most of that is free. Some of it carries a trifling charge. You can give the money to me or Mr. Gadd. And everything that you don't take away, we shall have to carry away. So do feel free to relieve us of some of that great weight to pack into the car. The other thing I'll say is that this would have been the end of today, but we've had to fit another session in. It's a big conference. You people just kept crawling out of the woodwork right up until late Thursday afternoon, and so the conference grew and grew and grew. And in the same way, the number of speakers grew and grew. So we have an optional session next on road pricing. An optional session means that you're welcome to stay and watch it, you're encouraged to stay and watch it, but do not feel obliged so to do. Where are the people for the optional session? Well, come forward. And Terry, can you fix up the video and the projector? Video there.